Welcome to my first Watch News show for 2021. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches and my first Watch News show for 2021. I used to do the news a fair bit, but then kind of got bored when I realized that there isn't that much news in the watch world and most of us just see it over and over again. So what I've decided, so I sort of stopped, but then a few of you have asked about it and I've kind of missed doing it. So what I'm going to do is come back and talk about the news probably every 2 months or so. So this will be covering the first 2 months of February. So with all of that said, what I should also say is I'm not really going to get into new watches as such. Normally, if a watch is interesting enough for me to talk about, I'll do a hot take on it. You might note I've done almost no hot takes this year. I don't think there's been a lot of really interesting new releases so far, but I do have a couple lined up, so you'll see those over the next week or two. Anyway, let's get into the news. The first is a story that was on Watch Pro talking about essentially the death of Kickstarter as a way of financing, funding, getting new watches out. Now, I've probably gone too hard on that. I shouldn't say the death, but what I would say is that what we can see is that the successful funding of new Kickstarter watches is plummeting. Got a lot to do with the fact that I think we don't need any more minimalist, cheap Chinese quartz stuff. And I think we're also pretty much over the cheap, Seiko movement powered Submariner homage. So I think those are whole segments of the market which have just died. I think another problem is a lot of these new brands are having to compete with Kickstarter alumni, those brands who did make it through that evolutionary fight and became effectively real brands. Does this mean Kickstarter and Indiegogo, etc. are dead? No, I don't think it does. I think truly good watches will still make it through. I think a lot of the dross is going to fail. And frankly, that's probably not a bad thing. So this is possibly, although superficially it looks like bad news, I think it is good news in that it says that rubbish isn't getting up. You can probably rely more on the good stuff that is getting through, and Kickstarter might actually be maturing as opposed to dying. Okay, so some other watch industry stuff has come out of the FH, Federation Horologie in Switzerland. Every month they put out their monthly export figures. All the usual. I'm not going to do a deep dive into it this year. What I would say is that the results that we saw in January would seem to indicate that the massive falls that we saw month on month through 2020 have largely resolved themselves, that the market is stabilizing back to a new normal. Will it climb back to where we were in 2019 numbers, noting that across the board, exports of Swiss watches are down around just over 20%. Will we ever get that 20% back? I have a suspicion we won't. I've got a suspicion that, as we know, a lot of companies went into like low production periods or shut down for an extended period of time. If you do look at, so there wasn't new product coming onto the market. If you look at the kinds of inventory you get from your traditional grey sellers like Joe Michel, Bob's Watches, those Chronex, those sorts of guys, you'll see inventory levels are way, way down. And a lot of the stock that they have is very, very old. I think that a lot of companies, a lot of the Richemont Group companies, Swatch Group companies, Breitling, a bunch of companies have been seeking to find a way to drain the grey market swamp and to stop the dumping that's happened. I think 2020 is going to be their kind of fuse breaker year, and that 20% of watches that wasn't exported, wasn't made, wasn't exported, will never be made, will never be exported. And they're kind of, that gap is going to be how the industry kind of gets rid of that excess inventory they had in the past. That's probably going to have a whole bunch of flow-on effects for the kinds of discounts you should accept, expect, what sort of things are going to end up in those grey market sellers and all that sort of thing. But I'm going to wait a few months. I think we need to see kind of the ramp back up to production to get a better sense of where that's going. Some of the other things that came out of looking at the FH numbers is China and Asia is where it's all at. And if you don't speak Chinese, you're kind of a marginal fringe market. That is, if you look at Asia is now 58% of the industry, you're seeing huge chunks of export that was going to Europe, was going to America, that was probably servicing the traveling Chinese, now being directed back into China. So we're probably getting a more representative picture of where the watches are actually being bought right now. And that just says Asia is the show that counts. And we need to be extraordinarily careful when we try and analyze what's going on in the global industry, looking at relatively small market segments like the US, which is around 14%, and Europe, which is like 28%. Oh, the other thing I would probably highlight is it looks like the Gulf states are taking over from Hong Kong as the international shipper of choice. What else? Okay, it was reported that Watches and Wonders is going to be all digital this year. No big surprise. It's also going to be invitation only, which means it's going to be a total dud, and it's essentially irrelevant. It's probably going to have all the charisma of the kinds of online Zoom calls that we routinely are now doing as a result of the pandemic. And after what we saw with LVMH and my report on that, I won't hold out any hope for any interesting content. The watch media guys will kind of beat it up because that's what they're required to do. But again, if the coverage of LVMH is any sort of guide, it's going to be a pretty shit show, and we shouldn't hold out too much hope for it. What else? They are going to do an IRL show as well. That's going to be in Shanghai. And this is interesting because it really feeds off that last point I was talking about, how Asia is really now the driving force, quite obviously the driving force in watches. When that was announced, if you look at some of the comments around the fact that China was going to have an IRL show, there were a lot of the comments in the English press media anyway were kind of negative, and who's going to go there and why would they bother doing it during a pandemic? Well, the answer is the important people, that is the Chinese journalists and the main Chinese distribution hubs, they'll all be there. And they're, as I say, at least 50 to 60% of the market. Enough of the rest of the world will probably get there to make it worth doing. We're going to have to get used to the idea that we're not the center of the universe anymore. And that's going to be pretty painful for a lot of people, I think. Speaking of not being the center of the universe anymore, the UK has left Europe now. It's now out on its own post-Brexit. There was a lot of discussion before Brexit about how this was going to be a wonderful time for new sellers and everything. I did a video last year kind of putting the kibosh on that, saying that my experience as being outside Europe from Australia is that it's kind of shit. And it's not a particularly good place to be to try and get hold of watches. And it looks like, according to a couple of articles in Watch Pro, my predictions are unfortunately coming true for Britain. In choosing to leave Europe, they have all of the normal all of the things that they've got used to in terms of not having to pay duty, not having to pay customs, transport being really easy, the transport of goods being really easy has gone away. And so I hate to say it, but yeah, welcome to the world of being an even smaller player outside of a big block in the West. The good news is it doesn't get any better, but you get used to it. Other news, Herdinki raised a bunch of capital back in December. There was a couple of articles in Watch Pro about it. I would have, if I'd had a news service, I would have covered it back then. I'm going to do it now. What was curious about that is the interview that Ben Clymer did with with Watch Pro at the time that they got all of this money. There was a couple of key kind of ideas in what Ben said, which we should have really been paying attention to. One, that they were getting all of this money and it was an exciting new development. Two, they were going to be creating a lot more content. And that word is really important. They saw themselves very much, he made it very clear here that he produces content, not news, not journalism, but he just produces content. What an anodyne and meaningless word that is. He then goes on to say that Instagram is effectively dead as a platform for an organization like him, and that YouTube is unreliable and probably also on the way out. So he's gathering all of this extra money. He's talking about all of this extra video and production he wants to do. But he also then says all of the traditional ways of distributing that, such as Instagram and YouTube, are dying. So what's he going to do with all the money, and what's the point of all the content if your distribution channels are going away? Well, we found out it all now supports his store. Herdinki have bought Crown and Calibre. All in all, that's probably a loss for us, I think, on our side. Crown and Calibre were very, if you were selling to them, they were very seller friendly, and their prices to sell when they were selling back to them, if you were a buyer, were also pretty friendly. So they were set up nicely as someone for us to use. Now, as it turns out, that was probably them essentially just priming the pump, getting some content up, getting transactions going so that they could be sold. So I strongly suspect that they were deliberately buying high and selling low so that they could get throughput, establish a foothold. They've probably burnt a bit of cash, but all of that's okay because the strategy worked and they've now been bought. So what does that mean? I reckon buy prices will go down and sell prices will go up because Herdinki has bought them and now wants to get some money back. What else does it mean? It probably means you can put the nail in the coffin. Maybe I was being overly naive, thinking that you could even take Herdinki semi-seriously as a media outlet. But I think you can now see with the Crown and Calibre thing that idea that Herdinki produces media that can be trusted is dead. Now they just produce a lot of content, which is really just fancy ways of saying ads. So now we know exactly what content means for Ben Clymer. Okay, curiously, the clues to this, if I'd have been paying more attention, you could have predicted it because the clues were actually in the interview he gave with Watch Pro earlier. Really, it was in his answer to the very, very last question. The last question from Watch Pro was really dragging up the old issue of independence for Herdinki and how Ben felt about complaints that he's trying to walk both sides of the street, being a media producer and being a journalist, if you like, and also selling product. And Ben's answer was super informative. And like I said, if I'd been paying more attention, you could have placed a bet that what he was going to do with all this new money. And his answer was that from his side, it's a non-issue, that this is all been and gone, and everyone loves Herdinki, and all they ever ask is that we would sell them even more. And he goes on to say, if you're not happy with that, and he understands a lot of other sellers aren't, then they should just get on the front foot and start producing their own content so that they can sell more of their own stuff. Interestingly, I don't know if he deliberately ignored the question, which was that as a result of the moves that they're making, they have surrendered all possible integrity as a media outlet, or whether he saw that and just chose to let it go through to the keeper and instead came back purely as a seller. Had he already transitioned himself to that point of saying, my job is to sell watches and content is just advertising. Maybe he'd already made that move, but certainly it's something we now have to get used to, and that's the way of the world now. Okay, so moving right along, the Rolex story, not really my bag, I don't care that much, but the Rolex tube is all over this stuff, so Mark Goldberg and all those other guys who just do nothing but talk about Rolex. This is a big deal for them, so they really care, so I'll cover it really quickly. Apparently, a dealer in America sacked a couple of workers. Those workers have then claimed that they were fired illegally because they wouldn't go along with some selling of Rolex scam. I think we've all been a little bit surprised that rather than roll and just give these guys a payout, the AD is now fighting back and is saying, fine, we'll go to court. We'll fight this out because we don't think we did anything wrong. That's actually quite interesting, but not really from a watch point of view. Okay, this is going to be the last thing I say about this. Okay, Rolex's business model is to sell a lot of watches that people to ADs, most of which they don't want, just so that they can get access to a small number of highly desirable steel sports watches. It is absolutely unsurprising that the ADs simply replicate that model, requiring their customers to do the same thing. Buy a lot of stuff they may or may not really want on the off chance that they can get a steel sports model. From my point of view, ADs aren't doing anything wrong. They're simply treating their customers the way they were treated by Rolex. If you've got a problem with that, take it up with Rolex. The ADs are just piggy in the middle and don't have a choice. I said I wasn't going to talk about individual watches, and I think I'm keeping that promise. There was a watch released that was big news this year so far, and that was the Zenith Chronomaster. A lot of coverage on that. The only coverage you really need to see is my 2 videos, because I think I covered it way better than anyone else. If you do want to get a different perspective, Worn and Wound actually did a fairly interesting podcast, which I'm probably agreeing with because they largely agree with what I'm saying, albeit a little bit later, to the point where I wondered whether that actually listened to my channel. But yeah, it was interesting. Okay, so to really understand that issue, I think you've actually got a step, which is the whole, how do we see a homage? What makes one person see it and not another person see it? All that sort of crap. What I'd suggest is you need to step out of the watch world, because the watch world doesn't do a lot of that kind of analysis. And I'd suggest you want to take up listening to a very specific podcast, which I love. It's a little bit, it's a bit easy listening, reduced, simplified for mass consumption, but it's really helpful. And that is the Hidden Brain podcast on National Public Radio. That's the channel, Hidden Brain, National Public Radio. Fantastic, unmissable. In the last 2 months, there's been 3 podcasts which have been really interesting in sort of addressing the kinds of issues that have come up through the whole Chronomaster kind of kerfuffle. 3 podcasts which have really narrowed in on what's going on in our heads that leads us to make sometimes some pretty dumb decisions and some poor analysis about stuff. The 3 podcasts I'd recommend that you want to see in this order, which is not the order that they were released, but it makes sense for if you want to make sense of like the Chronomaster thing. Well, the first is the double standard. The double standard is about our biases and how we impose. We always see bias in other people, but we never see it in ourselves. The second is actually jump forward in time to the easiest person to fool episode. That was on the 2nd of January. And again, that kind of takes that idea of our inherent biases and then reinforces it about how we kind of use our own biases to make ourselves feel happier about decisions that we wish were true. And then finally go back to an episode they had on the 19th of January, tripped over those words, called Our Brands Ourselves, about how we as individuals identify with brands. And before you say, I don't, you do, you just see the other 2 videos about how we fool ourselves. And then how that tricks us again, that builds on those other logical flaws and tricks us into doing things. Now, some of you are going to immediately come back and use my weapons against me and say, I was guilty of all of those things when I did the Zenith Chronomaster release. That is quite possible. All I can say in my defense is you can't get rid of any of those logical flaws and failures in thinking. What you can do, though, is know that you are likely to make them. Look for them. It's kind of like a golfer with a slice. Sometimes you can never get rid of a slice, but what you can do is acknowledge you've got it and then just re-aim. That's my view on these flaws. You can't engineer your brain differently. You can't get rid of them. But if you know they're there, you can play to minimize the damage. And that's what I try and do. And that's what I'd recommend you all try and do too. And the last piece of watch news, again from the watch media, is Federico from Federico Talks Watches has passed 100,000 subs. Great job, Federico. Well deserved. You and Watch Pro are clearly not Watch Pro, sorry. You and Watchfinder, Fed and Watchfinder are clearly the best dealer sites out there. The quality of production and analysis and the photos and those wonderful talking hands, make Watchfinder fantastic. And I really like Fed because, kind of like his company, Del Rey Watch, he takes a much broader view. He doesn't look through this very narrow periscope that so many other dealers do. And he brings a lot of more interesting ideas and more interesting brands to our attention. So great, well done, Fed. Hope you stick with it. And that's it for the news. That's everything that I reckon was interesting over the last 2 months in the watch world. I'll see you later. Bye.